All right, so today we are going to look at Chinese garden. So we will first focus on the private garden, and which is mostly associated with the residential compound. And garden is a very vulnerable form of architecture. It is very hard to find a old garden architecture, old garden design, because garden incorporate nature, and nature, of course, change dramatically. And the plan of the garden, the water body, and artificial hills, and also those natural element cannot be kept the same way for many centuries, right? So we really don't know much about ancient gardens. There are a lot of textual record about garden, from the Zhou dynasty and from the Han dynasty, etc. But as extant garden, they are mostly from the Ming and the Qing dynasty. The actual garden, physical remain are mostly from Ming and the Qing dynasty. And those Ming and the Qing dynasty private garden are especially tied with the, especially connected with the Literati culture. Literati refer to a group of people who went through the Confucian classical education, and they were capable of serving the state, serving the government, serving the emperor, and we call those scholar official, the literati, in imperial China. So we will focus on literati culture, residential architecture, and it's their relationship with the private garden. Chinese garden had a very different form compared to the palatial architecture. To some extent, garden design is more related to the Taoist ideology, while the palace and ritual architecture is more representing the Confucian ideology. And we can see that contrast by simply looking at the plan of, for example, the Summer Palace, which is an imperial garden here, and the Forbidden City. So today we are not going to focus on imperial garden, we will focus on private garden, but they share the same form and spatial design. On one hand, the garden as a Taoist architectural embodiment, it's not a Taoist architecture, right? But it kind of embodied the Taoist philosophy, is very free kind of in design. It does not have the axiality. It does not have symmetry. Everything is planned in organic forms, right? You don't find much straight line. All those lines are curving and zigzagging, following the topography. So it kind of reflects that Taoist ideology rather than the kind of Confucian hierarchical order as embodied in the Forbidden City and the city of Beijing. And even the plan kind of remind us the Taoist symbol of the Taiji symbol, right? The yin and yang symbol, where you have the the black representing the yin, and the white represent yang. But then for the Taoist philosophy, there's no pure yang. There's always some kind of a opposite element within it. So there is a black dot within, representing yin element within the yang area in the Taiji diagram. And then there is a white dot, representing yang within the yin half. And the yin and the yang are mutually enclosing, defining, and in complementing each other. There's no clear-cut straight boundary, and it's mutually incorporating, mutually defining. And that is the kind of comprehensiveness, the understanding everything as a complete one. That oneness is the key for the Taoist ideology. That it shouldn't be that clear-cut, hierarchical. Rather, it should have that kind of mutual incorporating feature for everything. For every opposite force, there is some kind of complement. There is some kind of a mixture in it. And there is always a kind of a female within a male, and there is also always a male muscular quality within a female. And it's that kind of a philosophy. And to some extent, the design of the garden has that quality. For example, you can see within this plan, there is a water half and there is a land half. But within the water part of the garden, there are small islands. And within that mountain or land half, there are smaller waterways and lakes within it, just like what the Taiji diagram is representing. So it's very different from the straightforward and unmistakable hierarchical order as represented in the Confucian palatial architecture. So here we are looking at the contrast between the Confucian palace and the Taoist garden in 3D. So in the garden, this is a private garden, by the way. For example, there's no straightforward straight connection between point A and point B. There's always some kind of a zigzag and indirect connection. For example, this bridge is zigzag, making that connection between point A and point B. While in the palace, in the Forbidden City, it's very straightforward, just straight, very direct connection. And standing at one point, you have a good understanding of the rest of the complex because they are going to be symmetrical. But in the garden, you never know what to expect. There's a lot of surprise. And everything is also shrouded in the lush nature and hidden behind something. And the human construction and the nature are intertwined, completed as one thing. Rather, in the Forbidden City, in the courtyard, you don't see a single tree, and it's representing the kind of a unmistakable domination of nature by the human culture, while in the garden, culture and nature are combined and mixed to create one environment. And the garden also represent in the late imperial period, as I mentioned, what we know physically about Chinese garden are mostly from the last 500 years, the Ming and the Qing period. And they are closely connected with the literati culture. And the literati, create a appreciation of nature, and that is expressed in the landscape painting. There are the four great art in literati culture. That is the qin playing. So here we are looking at a scholar playing qin. And some of you might know that I also play that instrument. And actually on the homepage of our class, there's a connection. There's a link to a YouTube channel that I created, and featuring this instrument. So it's a literati instrument, and the qin music is also associated with the literati culture. So is the landscape painting, and chess playing, and also calligraphy. And garden is also part of that literati culture. And that is, of course, based on the late imperial tradition for which we know about the Chinese garden. But that tradition started, of course, long before the late imperial period. We know that in the Tang Dynasty, some scholar official known as literati were already building garden for their kind of hermetic residence. And this is the famous legendary Wangchuan Villa by Wang Wei, a poet of Tang Dynasty. He was also celebrated as the first Chinese literati. He was from Tang Dynasty, long before the late imperial. So he was like from the medieval middle period Chinese history. But he was celebrated as the first Chinese literati. And he built himself the famous Wangchuan Villa, and that is often celebrated also as the ancestor of literati garden or the private garden. So of course it didn't exist, after the Tang Dynasty, but there are paintings attributed to Wang Wei, and showing that his villa is combined with nature. So there are mountains and trees, water body. All those are going to become the key element in Chinese garden. Water body and mountain element. Those are key element in Chinese garden. And in Song Dynasty, we have this landscape painting pretty much expressing the same ideology of later private garden. And in Yuan Dynasty, we have a lot of literati painting celebrating that kind of environment in the painted form. So we will recognize a lot of scene views like those depicted in the Song and Yuan Dynasty painting, but later it was constructed in actual garden and survived today from the Ming and the Qing Dynasty. For example, in this painting, there are these rocks, and in the actual private garden, we will see rocks that looks very similar to what is painted in this painting. So of course, those Ming and the Qing Dynasty, both the garden and landscape painting continued, and the gardens survived from the Ming Dynasty in greater quantity compared to previous period. So that is something we are going to look at mostly from after the Ming Dynasty, look at those gardens, and we will focus on the Jiangnan style, which represent the best of private garden in China. There are four styles. the Jiangnan style, focusing on the lower Yangtze Delta area, the northern style, especially in the Beijing area. The Lingnan style refer to the garden in South China, in Guangdong province, those area close to Hong Kong. And there are also the Sichuan style garden, a regional variation of garden in the Sichuan province. So these are the kind of a 4 major regional style of garden, but the most celebrated is the Lingnan garden, the Jiangnan garden, this area. And we will look at that area for the study of private garden in this lecture.